Hey, right, this talk is really about buildings that stand or stood in green spaces that are considered Enfield's historic landscape. And our story goes back 1,000 years, and it's really a potted history of Enfield. This is the Great Forest of Middlesex. This is the root of Enfield's historic landscape. In 1170, William Fitzstephen described it as a vast forest, its copses dense with foliage, concealing wild animals, stags, does, bears, and wild bulls. It stretched from virtually the city boundary, but technically it wasn't a forest. It certainly wasn't included in the Charter of the Forest of 1225, and all this land at one time would have been common land until sometime after the 9th century. What we call today feudalism developed, where the crown granted land to in return for knights' duties. Now, sometime during the Saxon period, a chief named Enna, we think it probably translates as lamb and maybe ironic, made a clearing in this forest and established a community there. This would have been roughly where the town triangle stands today, if you look at this David Pan map in the top left. Later generations would have built a manor house there, and it certainly existed in the early 14th century, and it survived right the way through till 1928. But then in a dilapidated condition, the leasee reneged on the last 7 years of the lease, and it was taken over by a couple of fine art dealers from Gentleman's Row called the Leggett Brothers, on the condition they would keep the last 7 years of the lease and pay it, on the condition that the Urban District Council would turn it into a town hall or a museum or put it to some good use. But the Enfield Council, I'm afraid, failed to act. And after 7 years, the Leggett brothers had no alternative but to sell. They stripped out some valuable Tudor fittings and installed them in an outbuilding in their house in Gentleman's Row. And today we have a fine department store, Pearson's. But there was a disgraceful lack of foresight on our council and the loss of a heritage site that included one of the first cedar trees in England. And this picture in the bottom right here is the staff of Pearson's sitting on that cedar tree. Now, sometime after 1136, Geoffrey de Mandeville, who was the grandson of a knight who'd come over with William the Conqueror, converted 2/3 of the Enfield parish into a hunting chase. Commoners, however, maintained rights to let their pigs feed on the beech mast in autumn. They were allowed to collect wood for fuel and repairs. They weren't allowed to kill the king's deer or chop down trees. Now, in the early 14th century, early 15th century, the chase came into the ownership of the Duchy of Lancaster. Now, since that time, the Duchy of Lancaster has been the crown. So the Queen is the present Duke of Lancaster. But they weren't efficient landlords. They leased out the chase to their cronies who despoiled the deer and the woodland they were supposed to protect. And, there were several attempts to enclose parts of the chase throughout its history. Particularly Cromwell in the interregnum tried to sell it off and did sell it off. But finally, in 1775, the Duchy decided to lease out lots of the chase. The Enclosure Act of 1777 was supposedly motivated by an age of agricultural improvements. The Act actually says the chase in its present state yields very little profit to either the King's Majesty or to freeholders, copyholders or their tenants, in comparison of what it might do if it was divided and improved. So allocations were given to the local parishes, but in the main, the land was sold to already wealthy landowners. Did they improve the land at the agriculture? Well, one man tried. His name was Abraham Wilkinson, and he purchased Whitewebb's farm in 1791. Now, he had to import 12 loads of chalk and 160 bushels of lime to each acre in an attempt to improve the soil. He followed a 4-year rotation of wheat, beans, wheat and fallow, and despite enlarging the 134-acre farm, the experiment failed. The soil on the chase was far too clayey. It's only really with the invention of the tractor in World War I could this soil on the western side of Enfield actually be turned and farmed. Wilkinson then demolished the Whitewebb's farm, and he built this French chateau style mansion on the other side of Whitewebb's Lane. Now, the old Whitewebb's farmhouse had a bit of history to it, and it went back at least until Elizabethan times, when a physician of Queen Elizabeth I, Robert Huick, actually leased the land. But of course, it's got this association with the Gunpowder Plot. Now, there was Anne Vaux, who was a Catholic family who leased it in the early 17th century. And we know that at least 2 of the Gunpowder plotters, Robert Catesby and Thomas Winter, were known to be at Whitewebb's in October 1605. And another important person who was up there was a young Jesuit priest called Oswald Tesimond. Now, as far as we know, Catesby actually confessed to the plot of the gunpowder plot to this young Jesuit priest. And Tessimon didn't know what to do. He'd got this information, and he actually then went to his superior, a chap called Henry Garnet, who was Anne Vaux's confessor and also at Whiteweb's, and rather rashly broke the confession, really, and told Garnet. Well, Garnet wasn't going to break the confession, but he did write to the Pope, asking them to warn Catesby not to act rashly. But unfortunately, his letter was intercepted, and unfortunately, he was eventually hung, drawn, and quartered. But another visitor at Whiteweb's at that date was Francis Tresham. Now, we think he was the man who actually sent the letter to Lord Monteagle, warning of the forthcoming plot. Anyway, so Wilkinson builds this house, and 100 years later, the Wilkinsons still own it. But in 1887, they select to a chap called Frederick Orr Lewis. His main claim to fame is that he actually survived the Lusitania sinking of that from the ship coming from New York in 1915, sunk by a German U-boat. He was actually given the baronetcy of Whiteweb's Park in the parish of Enfield in the county of Middlesex on the 12th of February 1220, but a year and a half later he was dead, and it was passed down to his son Duncan Orr Lewis, who was a diplomat and a friend of the Prince of Wales. But he, in 1931, sold it to Enfield Urban District Council, who sold it for the benefit of the people of Enfield. Now, since then, the park has provided space for both municipal golf courses and ancient woodland, and of course, the Toby Carvery. In 1955, they reckon there was 232 acres here. But today, of course, the estate is under threat. They want to put it into private hands again. The golf course has been closed, although it's quite nice to walk across it in these days. And if you look on Tottenham Hotspur's website, they're now bragging that they are proud to have been selected by Enfield Council as the highest scoring bidder to regenerate Whiteweb's Park. Well, of course, they've made all these promises that they'll turn the clubhouse, both the CAF at the bottom of the park there and the clubhouse, is now looking pretty sorry for itself at the top end, and look after the woods. But unfortunately, Tottenham Hotspur have got an unfortunate history in bending and breaking the promises in the past. Up at Ball's Cross, where they promised they wouldn't build buildings, and now they've actually got hotels on the site. So it's not a particularly good deal as far as I'm concerned regarding Whiteweb's. So Whiteweb's now. Also in the chase was this. There was 3 large lodges that was the home of the Rangers. Now, of the largest, West Lodge was the largest. People like Henry Coventry, Secretary of State for Charles II, lived here, and later on the Dukes of Chandos had connections here. But by this time, the chase had been despoiled. Most of the trees had been felled, the deer had disappeared, and the old house had become dilapidated. And after enclosure, the house was used as a family home. Briefly as a rest home for nurses during World War I. And then in 1924, it opened as a private hotel. But in 1945, Edward Beale actually took the lease over. And when he took the lease over, he also took over a 10-acre field previously sublet to a farmer and began an ambitious scheme of tree planting with professional design. And since then, more trees and shrubs have been added. And there's now over 800 different varieties of trees up in West Lodge Hotel. And in 10 years ago, 2012, after having the lease for 67 years, the Beale family actually purchased the freehold. They'd only had the leasehold, and the people they bought it from was the Duchy of Lancaster, i.e. the Crown. Now, you can go in there and actually look at this arboretum that they've got there. It's always worth having Andrew Beale to take you round. But yeah, you can go in. If you go and have a cup of coffee in the CAF there, they'll let you do it free. Otherwise, they'll ask for a donation of £3.50. So trees that's left of the chase and more. Now, Trent Park really revolves around 3 lots that were sold to a chap called Richard Jebb, who was a quack doctor. Lots 20 was sold for agriculture, and lots 21 and 22 were for hunting. They were hoping they would keep some deer up at Trent Park. Now, this chap, Jebb, let's say this quack doctor, he was supposed to have cured the king's brother. Poor old George III had his mental problems, but his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, had to travel to Trento in northern Italy to recover. And it was this chap, Jebb, who actually cured him. So that's how the house got the name Trent Park. The house wasn't that impressive, according to William Chambers, the royal architect. He said, it appears that the Enfield Chase Villa, ill-contrived as it is, and more than once altered, consumed over £19,000. The loggia, for such that it should be called rather than a house, being hardly calculated for a single man and his servants, is only about 30 feet by 40, and the largest room scarce 20 feet by 16. Now, when Jeb died, the Earl of Cholmondeley bought the estate and went through various owners. But our most interesting last two owners was in 1833, when David Bevans, a banker and a Quaker, well, according to family legend, he actually bought Trent Park because he went to an auction and kept nodding off. And the auctioneer thought he was bidding. And at the end of it, he ended up with Trent Park House. Now, if it's not true, I want it to be, but it probably isn't. But the Bevans were quite good benefactors locally. They paid for Christchurch to be, in Cockfosters to be built. But in 1908, the Bevans sold to Edward Sassoon. He was an MP for Hythe and the friend of Edward VII, and a merchant banking family. And he'd married into the Rothschild, so he was very wealthy. But he had an automobile accident in 1911 and never recovered. And when he died the following year, it was his son, Philip Sassoon, who took over Trent Park House and gave us the house that we know today. Because these lovely red bricks that you see and recognise and know well of Trent Park actually were only from the mid-1920s, when Devonshire House was demolished in Piccadilly. Sassoon bought the bricks and refaced Trent Park that we know today. Now, he also planted all the daffodils and narcissi in front of the mansion for his Easter guests. But Sassoon died in 1939, and soon after the outbreak of war, a lot of you know this story, it was requisitioned by the War Office and turned into a prisoner of war camp as a sort of interrogation centre known as MI-19, mainly for Nazi officers who was suspected of having useful information. They were taken to Trent Park, not only interrogated, they were also bugged. I mean, they were treated, they were given magazines that were manufactured, and they were given... really, they were pampered up there and taken to days out and to cream teas, but they listened in to what these people had to say. And from the listening ins, we found out about things like the Enclosure Act, the direction of how they were bombing directions, and the V2s were uncovered, as well as Holocaust confessions. But shortly after World War II, Trent Park was taken over by the Ministry of Education because they needed teachers desperately, and they had this training course for male teachers. Students were rushed through a 6-month crash course to attain degrees. And then in September 1974, Trent Park College was incorporated into Middlesex Polytechnic. In the meantime, in 1951, Middlesex County Council bought the entire Trent Park estate by compulsory purchase under the Greenbelt land. And in 1965, when the LCC, or Middlesex County Council, was dissolved, the estate was divided between the London Borough of Enfield, who took over the college grounds, and the GLC, who looked after the parkland. And in 1973, the GLC officially opened 415 acres of Trent Country Park. Following the abolition of the GLC in 1986, the park was passed to London Borough of Enfield. And of course, Middlesex University left Trent Park 10 years ago. It was sold to a Malaysian college, who then went bankrupt. And today, of course, you'll know that the house is part of an estate being developed by Berkeley Homes, quite a responsible developer by most standards. And of course, they've supported the Trent Park Trust, who are raising funds to create a museum and visitor centres in the house, which they hope to open in 2024. Now, in late Elizabethan, early Jacobean reigns, certain projects were put forward to bring fresh water to London. Edmund Colthurst obtained a charter to bring fresh water from the city from 2 springs at Chadwell and Amwell, just south of Hertford. And he soon ran out of money. And it was taken over by this wealthy goldsmith called Hugh Middleton, and a team of shareholders who were later joined by James I. Now, neither Middleton nor James lived to see their investment turn into profit. However, later investors made huge profits, mainly by stealing vast amounts of water from the River Lee and supplying intermittent, poor quality water to London citizens, which they continued to do until they were taken over by the Metropolitan Water Board in 1902. Now, one of these investors was the Garnalt family, a wealthy Huguenot family who became treasurers and governors to the New River Company. Now, in 1799, if you want to be a success in life, work hard, save hard, and marry into money. And this chap, Henry Carrington Bowles, married the survivor of the Garnalt family, a lady called Anne Garnalt. And with that, he inherited a house called Bowling Green House. Now very wealthy, Carrington Bowles demolished the house and built the house that we know today as Middleton House, completed in 1818. Now, unfortunately, only 2 of Henry and Anne's 5 children had children to continue the line, and both of those were daughters, thus ending the direct male line of the Bowles-Garnett line. But their daughter, Anne Sarah, who'd inherited the house, married a chap called Edward Treacher. In fact, her sister also married a Treacher. And the deal was that anybody who was going to inherit Middleton House had to be a Bowles. So they carefully named their son Henry Carrington Bowles Treacher. But when it came to inherit, that the solicitors actually pointed out, no, you've got Treacher as your last name. You can't inherit. It's got to be Bowles. So he actually changed his name to Henry Carrington Bowles in 1852 in order to meet the inheritance requirements for Middleton House. Anyway, the line continued in succession, but not as a genetic male line. But poor old Henry Carrington Bowles, a justice of the peace and also the last governor of the New River Company, had 4 children. Unfortunately, his eldest son died of consumption, and his daughter also died of consumption while she was nursing him. The youngest son, Gussie, continued to live in Middleton House until 1954, and he became a famous horticulturalist. In 1954, the School of Pharmacy the London School of Pharmacy bought Middleton House, which it then shared with the Royal Free Medical School. And of course, now it's the Lee Valley Regional Parks who have sold it. And the grounds, the grounds are open to most people. And of course, the Garnett name survives in the house opposite. This was built by the Carrington Bowles family in 1860. And to me, it looks like a Metropolitan Water Board pumping house. I'm sure they must have used the architect from the Metropolitan Water Board or the old New River architects to build it. But of course, this is the house where the Bosanquet family lived. Now, I said that Gussie Bowles, the youngest, inherited Middleton House. Well, the other brother, Henry Ferryman Bowles, was fortunate enough to be given, when he married Florence Broughton in 1895, to be given Faulty Hall as his home. Faulty Hall, Henry Ferryman Bowles was our MP for many years. He trained as a lawyer. He was always known as Colonel Bowles, who I can find no record of him actually doing any service apart from the volunteers. But anyway, Faulty Hall was built by is one of the 2 Grade 1 listing buildings in Enfield, and many people think it's the jewel in the crown, which I think quite rightly, built sometime between 1639 and 1642 by this chap Nicholas Rainton, this wealthy haberdasher. In the 18th century, the Breton family extended the estate, and it was those who created the pleasure gardens that surround the house now. They also, beg your pardon, in the 19th century, it was the Mayer family, who are Dutch businessmen, were the tenants. They paid for the building of Jesus Church up there. But in 1895, Henry Ferryman Bowles moved in with his family. So they had Middleton House, they had Faulty Hall. It didn't stop them, though, because they had their eyes on the next building south, which was Goth Park. I mean, Goth Park and House had been built in 1719 by Sir Harry Goth, who was a director of the East India Company. It was inherited by his son, Richard Goth, the antiquarian, the man who found the Goth map that you often see on television, the earliest map of Britain. And after Goth died, it went through several hands. It seemed to be in the wrong position. But in 1900, the Bowles family bought the estate and demolished the house. And all that remains today is the gateway that you can see at the bottom of Faulty Hall. And this wonderful path that leads through from the bottom of Faulty Hall through to the back of the Rose and Crown and the back of the Whitewebs golf course, which was created in 1963 by the Enfield Society in that terrible winter of 1963. The Enfield Society created this wonderful path that it's a great secret. It's one of my favourite walks in Enfield. Now, Henry Ferryman Bowles wasn't the only man who demolished houses in our current borough. Over on the western side, the Arnolds Grove that we know today, well, goes back. We think there was a Marjorie Arnold who owned land here back as 1344. But we think when James Colebrook built the house, much of the house that we know today, invited over some Italian or Florentine painters. They couldn't pronounce Arnold, and the Arno, of course, flows through Florence, and it seemed to get converted to Arnos. But the main people who were associated with this was 4 generations of the Walker family. And the Walker family, very wealthy people, they had also the instinct to knock down any houses that they could see from their windows. Places like Minchenden House on Southgate Green and Beaver Hall in Waterfall Road. When they come onto the market, the Walker family would outbid everyone, and then as soon as they've got it, they would demolish them. Now, the legend has it they couldn't bear to see another man's chimney from their windows, but they were great benefactors to Southgate, particularly the cricket club and the schools. But this selfish act of destruction actually created a mini green belt in Southgate, which was nearly lost. After 4 generations, the estate was sold to a chap called Andrew Weir in the first decade of the last century. He was a shipping magnate, later Lord Inverforth, and he intended to turn the estate into a housing estate with shops on Southgate Green. Now, fortunately, Southgate Urban District Council forced him to give up 44 acres to form what we know today as Arnolds Park, and also saved the green. There was only 3 commons left in the borough: Winchmore Hill Green, Southgate Green, and Chase Green. Now, they had relatives, did the Walkers, over in Winchmore Hill. A chap called Walker Gray, who was a brandy merchant, actually bought the estate here that was known as Lord's Grove, going back to the time of Elizabeth I. And he bought it off of the Duke of Buckingham, who was a descendant from the Chandos family. They built Grovelands in 1797. John Nash was the architect, the Regency architect, and Humphrey Repton was the landscape gardener. And this is the other Grade 1 building in our borough. Anyway, he also decided that if a property that he could see from his window came on the market, he would buy it and knock it down, particularly Cullen's Grove at the top of Alderman's Hill, which was knocked down by Walker, not Walker Gray, his nephew, actually, John Donnithorne Taylor. Now, when John Donnithorne Taylor died, it was passed to Robert Kirkpatrick Taylor, who decided to sell the whole estate, and up to 600 acres were put up for sale. The Lakes Estate in Palmer's Green was probably the most successful purchase and development there. But in 1913, Southgate Urban District Council actually purchased the estate, and we're thankful for them for allowing us to enjoy Grovelands Park today. Although researching this talk, it's on English Heritage Register of dangerous areas, not dangerous areas, risk areas. Now, to finish off, I think I've done it in less than 15 minutes, which you asked me to do. We'll talk about Broomfield House. This was a farm in early Tudor times, and it was purchased by this chap, John Spencer, whose daughter married the Marquis of Northampton. And of course, even today, the 7th and current Marquis of Northampton is Spencer Compton. Anyway, he bought it in 1599, but he never actually lived to enjoy it. Later, tenants increased size until the beginning of the 20th century. The family who owned it were Libby Purvis. Did she write on the television? Libby Powis. And they decided to sell the estate for housing. But in stepped this man called William Eleanor. He was a councillor for Southgate Urban District Council, and he was trying to urge the council to actually buy it as a park and buy the house as well. But they were tarrying, and finally Libby Powis actually put a pressure on William Eleanor and said, you've got to make a decision. You either buy it or you don't. And William Eleanor actually pulled out his own checkbook and actually wrote out a cheque for £25,000 from his own money and gave it to Libby Purvis to make Libby Powis to actually save the estate that we know today. And that cheque that was reimbursed, this Urban District Council made out to William Eleanor, is actually, he got the money back from Southgate Urban District Council, and the museum service actually showed me the cheque and allowed me to photograph it a couple of years ago. So, Southgate District Council actually did some good things. Of course, sadly, now that the house has the house was two bad fires in the 80s and 90s, and it's remained derelict. The house, what you see in this Tudor, actually is only a 20th century addition, but we'll have to wait and see what happens to it. But Broomfield Park has got a dynamic friends group, and it is a well loved and well used community asset.